And it doesn't matter how far that has went, because Job couldn't get any lower. He lost absolutely everything that he had. He really, and I'm sure if you have read it, you would soon realize that he was in the depths of despair. He thought that was it, finished. But praise God, somebody stepped in. And this was a younger man compared to the other three friends. We see that, but not only was that he was younger, but the other thing was he had wisdom. He had great wisdom. And as I said, this man stepped in, but one of the beauties of this man stepping in was, if we had to look at his name and the meaning of his name, then there's really two thoughts on this, because one idea is God be, or the other idea is, my God is my helper. My God is my helper. You see, Elihu knew his God. But better than that, I think, God knew Elihu. You know, there's many here, if I had to ask, not that I would, but there's many here if I had to ask, has God been your helper? Then I know, I'm sure the response would come back, yes, he's been my helper. And you know, that's testimony in itself, because if we are in the depths of despair, if we have lost everything, as it were, if we've nowhere to turn, then we can turn to God, the helper. And there is always hope. There is always hope. Because God, as we will see, can intervene, and God can take a hopeless situation and make it a hopeful situation. Certainly, I feel that this man is often overlooked in the Bible. And yet, as we read from 32 to 37, we see that he has a very important role to play in these chapters. We see also that he has been relatively quiet up until this point. I think probably the reasons, or one of the reasons that he's been relatively quiet, is because of his age. And the fact that he had respect for those who were older than him. And yet, just because these men were older than him, doesn't mean that they had more wisdom. We see that Elihu was a lot wiser than the other three men, despite being younger. And I suppose, there is an interesting lesson right at the outset. We see that Elihu waits until he interjects and speaks. One reason might be he's waiting till the friends exhaust what they're saying, and then he interjects. As I said earlier, the reason is that he may just have good manners. He may just have good manners. He respects his elders, those who are older than him, And maybe that is a lesson for us, as I'm sure we all know, that we must respect our elders. And also that, as Christians, as believers, then I think it's paramount that we should have good manners. We should be kind, we should be considerate, we should be respectful. It is something that we should be known for. But if we read the text, then Elihu himself gives us a reason for him refraining to speak. Because it says he was young in years and timid. He was young in years and timid. Verse 8 of 32, I think it is, shows us where wisdom, real wisdom and knowledge comes from. Because Elihu doesn't give credit to himself for the wisdom. No, he gives credit to God for the wisdom. It says this, but it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. You see, true wisdom, true knowledge, true understanding can only come from one place, and that is from God himself. When I was thinking about that verse, then we see that it actually could be split up into three different sections. And the first section is this, that the spirit in man. And if we are believers, and it doesn't really matter whether we are younger or older, men or women, the Spirit is in us. If we are believers, then the Spirit is in us. And we have the capacity to speak wise words. When the Spirit enables us, then we have got the capacity to speak wise words. And as I said before, the reason that Elihu could do this was it certainly wasn't his words he was speaking. It's the words that God gave him. Secondly, we can see in that verse the breath of the Almighty. The breath of the Almighty. When I looked that up, then it becomes quite clear in different passages in Scripture that the breath of the Almighty refers to the power of life. We see, of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, in the book of Genesis, that God breathed into man and it became alive. You know, we might be feeling dead in our sin. We might be feeling as if, in one sense, all life has been drained from us. God can breathe new life into your life. There's that famous question in the book of John, where somebody says to Jesus, "How can a man be born again? How can he enter a second time into his mother's womb?" And of course, as we all know, Jesus goes on to explain how this happens. You see, God can bring light into darkness. God can breathe life into something that's dead or dying. All we need to do is say, "Here I am." And if there is sins that need confessed, then we confess it. If we do need forgiveness, then we ask for forgiveness. And then God the Almighty, and only God, can breathe new life into us. And then the last thing we see in this verse is that it makes him understand. The Spirit is God. The Spirit of God is able to help you understand. Not only that, not only is he able to help you understand, but he speaks through you as well. I've told this story before, and forgive me if I tell it again. Some of you may have heard it, some may not. When I went to do the university work, I arrived at the place on the Sunday evening and went down for some supper. And I sat there timid and quiet and listening to all these other men that was there. And I thought to myself, I ain't got a clue what they're speaking about. Haven't I got the foggiest of what they're some of the words I hadn't even heard of before that they were using. And I remember going up to my bedroom and phoning Sharon and saying to her, "That's it, I've had enough." I says, "I'm coming home tomorrow." And she says, "You've just arrived." I said, "I may have just arrived, but I can assure you I'm heading up the road tomorrow." And she says, "Well, why don't you give it until Wednesday and see what happens? And if you still feel it's no for you, then fair enough, that's okay." So I remember quite clearly being in the room, single room, and praying to God and saying, "If you want me to be here, you will need to give me the knowledge and understanding. Because I can assure you it's not there naturally." The next morning I went down to the breakfast and went to the first lecture, and I could understand everything. You see, what God had done was gave me the understanding. God can give you the understanding. If you're reading scriptures, if you're reading a Bible passage and you think, "What on earth is that all about?" ask God to help you understand. And he will help you understand. One of my friends, his stepdad, when he left school, he was illiterate. And long story short, he became a Christian. And with the help of somebody else, he started to read his Bible. And that was a way that he learned to read, was simply by reading the scriptures. He was given understanding. In Ephesians, it speaks about new life. New life that believers can enter into. In verse 29 of chapter 4, where it speaks against what comes out of your mouth, when it says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. You know, when we look at Elihu and the wisdom that he had, the understanding that he had, then you understand that there was not excuse me, there was nothing corrupt came out of his mouth. So dangerous, even as Christians, to let things come out of our mouth that maybe shouldn't be. Corrupt talk doesn't come from God. Only good and wise words. Elihu goes on to speak some really wise words when we read verses 17 and 18. I also will answer my share. I will also declare my opinion, for I am full of words. The Spirit within me constrains me. Some of you might be saying, I wish the Spirit in you, Willie, would constrain you, but that's another story. So but actually, even in this, we see that Elihu has spent 22 verses speaking. And I think he does realize that. And maybe he wants to say things that aren't really wise. Hence why he's saying that the Spirit within me constrains me. Basically, what Elihu is saying is, in verse 22, look guys, I have got something really important to say here. And I think that makes them sit up and listen. Again, I think there may be a lesson in that for us. Because maybe, as I say, we have got a thought, or maybe we've got something to say, and we realize that it's actually not going to build that person up. And maybe the Spirit constrains us from saying it. Verses 21 and 22, if we look forward, it says, I'm not going to flatter you. I'm not going to flatter you. I'm not going to show you favoritism. Because if I flatter you and show you favoritism, then I will be answerable to God. And God may well take me out of the equation. You see, flattery and favoritism doesn't do anybody any good. Again, I suppose a good lesson here is, why do we say what we say? Why do we say what do we say? Is it just to flatter somebody? Is it just to show favoritism? Do we say what we say because we don't want to offend them or upset them? Maybe there are times that we do need to say things. And a good friend will say things that we don't always like to want to hear. But sometimes it's important. Sadly, in the days, I've said this before, but sadly in the days that we live, even from the pulpit, there is a lot of flattery goes on. Sometimes people are frightened to tell others what it's really like or what it's really going to be like. I remember reading about Billy Graham, and he preached a sermon, The Offence of the Cross. You see, one reason the cross can be offensive is because it exposes our sin. Not only does it expose our sin, it doesn't just suggest a new lifestyle, but it demands a new lifestyle. And for some, then the cross in that sense can be offensive. It also says in Timothy that we shouldn't preach to tickle people's ears. We shouldn't preach simply to flatter people. As I said before, sometimes the truth can hurt. If we are faced with our sin, then that can hurt. But the important thing is that we are not just faced with it, but as we are faced with it, then we deal with it. And once we deal with it, then we can move on. We also, of course, should always be listening to what the Spirit of God says. I think in chapter 36, if we jump down to chapter 36, again in verse 2, we see Elihu saying something that's really interesting and important. Because he says, "Bear with me a little, and I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf." Elihu realizes that he has been speaking for a while, but then he realizes that he's speaking on God's behalf. I don't know about you, but personally, I think that is sobering and very, very challenging. Especially if I say I'm speaking on God's behalf. If we are speaking from Scripture. If we are standing up front, then we are speaking on God's behalf. Hence why what we say must be accurate. What did we say about Elihu? He says, if I flatter you, then I am at the risk of God taking me out. God take me out of the equation. And here he's saying, I'm speaking on God's behalf. If you like, he's proclaiming the good news. I don't know about you, but that certainly is a sobering thought. As we stand here telling others about Christ, are we speaking on God's behalf? If we are, then we use the Lord's wisdom and not our own. Certainly, when we read chapter 37, we realize that it was the words of God that Elihu spoke. And I'm just going to take a minute just to read some of these words, amazing words, that Elihu speaks. And one of the reasons we actually know that in chapter 36, one of the reasons we know that it's God's words is if we compare it to chapter 37, we see some similarities in the two chapters. Elihu extols God's greatness in chapter 36. Elihu continued and said, "Bear with me a little while and I will show you. For I have yet something to say in God's behalf. I will get my knowledge from him afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false, and one who is perfect in knowledge is with you." And here it's here. Behold, God is mighty. Behold, God is mighty, and does not despise any. He is mighty in strength of understanding. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives the afflicted their right. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but with the kings on the throne. If they're not bound in chains and caught in the cords of affliction, then he declares them to the work. He opens their ears to instruction and commands that they return from the iniquity. And if we go down to chapter 37, we see that this continues. At this also my heart trembles and leaps out of its place. Keep listening to the thunder of his voice, God's voice, and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it go, his lightning to the corners of the earth. After it his voice roars. He thunders with majestic voice. He does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. God thunders wondrously with his voice. He does great things that we cannot comprehend. For to the snow, he says, fall on the earth. Likewise to the downpour, his mighty downpour. He seals up the hand of every man, that all men whom he made may know it. The beasts go into their lairs and remains in their dens. Verse 10, by the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. He loads the thick cloud with moisture. The clouds scatter his lightning. They turn around and around by his guidance to accomplish all that he commands them on the face of the habitable world, whether for correction or for his land or for love, he causes it to happen. And so it goes on. You see, Elihu is showing the majesty. He's telling Job about the majesty, about the greatness, about the authority that God had. What a wonderful God Elihu worships. What a wonderful God Job worshipped. What a wonderful God we worship. The God that speaks and things are created. The God that controls the lightning. The God that controls the thunder. The God that controls the rain and the snow. That's the God that we worship. And guess what? As I said earlier, if we've got faith in that God, then He can turn our life around in an instant. If He can control the heavens, if He can control the earth, if He can breathe life into the dead, He can change my life in an instant. And He can do that for you as well. That chapter speaks of His greatness. Micah's famous Bethlehem prophecy tells of a majesty that is greatness in one coming. It says, stand the shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in all majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure. For now He shall be great to the ends of the earth. Micah 5 and 4. Now we see in that chapter, it speaks about His power. Not only does Micah 5 connect God's majesty with divine strength and shepherding His people, but in Psalm 68:34, it forges the bond even stronger. Because 68 and 34 says this, ascribe power to God, whose majesty is over Israel, and whose power is in the skies. I don't know about you, but I think that is awesome. His majesty, His power, His generosity that He gives. He is the one who gives power and strength to His people. If we had to read passages like Psalm 68 and 35, we would see that. Also in Psalm 29, verse 4, we see it as well. And we hear it rather. Because Psalm 29, verse 4 says, the voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. That is the God that we worship. That is the God who we come here each Sunday and give glory and honor to, the one whose majesty is seen in the skies, whose majesty is seen in creation, whose power and greatness is seen in your life and is seen in my life. As Elihu enters the scene, because of his wise words, because of his care, because of the way that he builds Job back up, then we see a wind of change. That wind of change, as I said at the beginning, can be for you as well. If we only are willing to accept Him, have an impact in our lives. There's a song, and it's quite simple. I love to sing it, and it says, I surrender all. All to Jesus I freely give. Are we willing this morning to surrender everything to Jesus? Aye, all the good stuff, but also all the bad stuff. Simply say, I surrender all. After thinking about the wonders and the power and the majesty of God, I don't think there's another hymn that we could sing except how great is our God. The splendor of the King. And we'll stand and we'll sing this hymn, How Great is Our God.